Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. The NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels to coordinate military support and long-term security for Ukraine. With Norway together, Poland and Germany pledging $500 million under the prioritized Ukraine requirements list. Meanwhile, in Moscow, talks between Vladimir Putin and the U.S. negotiation team ended after several hours without reaching a breakthrough. And now to analyze the latest, we're joined by Wierenga Lecturer in International Relations at the Baltic Defence College. Good to have you back on TVP World.
Good morning, Sascha. Great to be with you.
I want to start off with NATO right away. We have these breaking announcements, this PURL, that basically essentially this mechanism by NATO countries to buy ready-made weapons from the United States for Ukraine. We've just had these announcements from Poland, Germany, Norway, $500 million as a package. How significant is that in terms of how much this will be giving Ukraine what it needs on leverage on the battlefield?
Significant, but of course, more is needed. About 2/3 of allies have already contributed to the Pearl, and the total, all of the packages, the 5 separate packages, worth about $2.5 billion US. But the Secretary General of NATO announced last week that allies would have to spend about $5 billion by the end of the year. And a couple of other countries have decided that they would take part. Also, notably, some non-NATO countries like Australia and New Zealand are planning to contribute to the Pearl scheme. And I think one of the big meetings that the foreign minister, or one of the big topics on the foreign minister's agenda will be the Pearl. It won't be the only one. And I think, you know, for the next year, the Secretary General is looking to get 1 million USD a month. So there's more to be spent. There's more that should be spent, and there likely will be more. And that is one of the hot topics that's going around different ministerial meetings. And you know, we have about half of a year and some before the next NATO summit in Turkey. And I would assume that developments for the Pearl will develop prior to that, but that will still be on the agenda when allied heads of states and government meet at the summit in Turkey this summer.
Mm-hmm. But it's also interesting, you have, as you mentioned already, there are several countries involved, not every single NATO ally, but even some that are not in NATO, pledging various amounts, 100, 200, 500 million there. How much does this really, let's say, meaningfully pressure Russia in any way? Is this something that Putin, let's say, does this sway him at all? How do he perceive all this?
I'm sure that he's taking it into his calculus because with the U.S. 28-point peace plan, that was seen by European allies in Canada as being quite favorable to Moscow, actually. And so what European allies are doing is trying to shore up as much support for Ukraine as possible and also bolster their defense, because right now, what's going on is really a multilateral format that they can provide, which shows, you know, a unanimous consensus front for allies, also support the Ukraine, and you know, there are, of course, a lot of diplomatic moves here, and the NATO Secretary General seems to be quite positive about this because he has dismissed some of the complaints about the U.S. 28-point plan that was presented by Witkoff and the United States as, you know, a starting point where you start the negotiations. But basically, all of the foreign ministers are going to discuss how to maintain the consistent flow of American weapons to Ukraine, which are purchased by allied countries and then sent to Ukraine. So this kind of feeds into the more transactional nature that the Trump administration is taking. But I think that Putin has got to be thinking about how strong NATO is becoming and how seriously that the allies are taking the security environment and how quickly these movements are happening. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think that as you mentioned earlier, the Witkoff and Kushner meeting with Putin didn't really achieve much. It was a meeting that didn't have any like actual, you know, movement out of it. But both the United States and Russia haven't really disclosed too many details to the media about the talks that they've had. So I think in the coming weeks, we'll see if there's been any movement on that. Likely there won't have been, and it'll be back at square one. So I think that all of the assistance that's being provided to Ukraine is just a further statement about how far allies are willing to go to support Ukraine and make sure that if they're not given a seat at the table in the bilateral talks, that their voice is still being heard and their concerns are still being met.
Mm-hmm. So that was going to be my next sort of point here. I mean, let's talk about what happened in Moscow, or rather what didn't happen in Moscow. I mean, we have from this official from the Kremlin saying it was constructive. As you said, we don't really have any indication yet from the U.S. side. But mixed signals once again. Should we already be disappointed? Should we still be hopeful? I mean, what could we see even in the next few days out of this? I mean, Marco Rubio, everyone was rather optimistic just 24 hours ago. Where do we stand in your mind?
Well, I think that there's two sides to that coin. You know, on the one hand, you would say that, yeah, we should be disappointed because of this 28-point plan, largely favorable to Moscow, and it really is not the U.S. asserting, you know, the needs of and requests of both Ukraine and NATO allies, which, let's not forget, while Russia is engaging in a aggressive, high-intensity kinetic war of aggression against Ukraine, they're also upping the ante in hybrid threats, both in the air domain and the maritime domain, in the cyber domain, in the information domain. I mean, they're really, you know, keeping their finger on the pulse to attack European allies in the gray zone, and that's just boundary testing and trying to see what the response is going to be, and so. I know the question was directed about the U.S., but I don't want to cut out European allies, because I think the important thing is that there is a response. They're not just sitting back and waiting. There's a lot of discussions between ministers and military and everyone else in the allied community. But in terms of what the United States is doing, the other side of that coin would be starting at the negotiating table. But, you know, the factor there is that they've been, having these quote unquote peace talks for quite a while, even before the 28-point plan was presented. And if you want to drive a hard bargain, you do have to take into consideration the give and take. But this is not a trade deal. This is a very serious deal that has global implications, first and foremost for Ukraine's security, peace, and prosperity, and second of all for allied countries that are in NATO's northeastern flank. So I don't think that the movement was quick, but then you also have to remember that Putin's not somebody who likes to budge. And I think that, the Trump administration has been assertive at times, and they've been, I guess, more diplomatic in their own way at times. But I think it's also important to remember a couple of things that were said by the Russians after this meeting, and Putin said if Europe wants to go to war and starts one, we're ready right now. And that type of aggressive rhetoric isn't really anything new. He likes to saber rattle. He likes to make statements like that. So I wouldn't read too much into that, except for that, Russia is being the way that they always are. Mm-hmm. No compromise was reached, of course, and a lot of work still remains to be done. But apparently, Russia has gotten additional documents from the U.S. for the discussion. So I think we'll have to wait and see if the contents if part of what's in those documents are revealed. That might give a better picture as to what the U.S. is going to try to do with the future rounds of negotiations with the Russians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to have to wait, and of course we're all waiting with bated breath on what is actually announced by U.S. Authorities from the administration. Look, I also want to ask you on the European angle. I mean, this is something right now we're seeing unity, of course. We have major allies on the side of Ukraine, but at the same time, recently, I want to get your sense. I mean, the Germans have just stepped out with this Purell program as well, contributing to that with the Poles and the Norwegians as well. Just today, that announcement. But the foreign minister Mr. Vadeful also said recently that Ukraine may need to make painful concessions. Now, how do we read that? Coming from an ally like Germany, what does that imply for where this is going?
Well, I mean, that is not the line that you really would like to hear from European allies. And I hope that wouldn't mean conceding territory or, because again, if the peace deal is signed between the United States and Russia without Ukraine, or if it's presented to Ukraine and they don't want to sign it, then that's just being done above their heads. So, if and when President Zelensky does agree to a peace plan, so far he has correctly not been willing to budge and give in to any Russian demands. And a remark like that, I'm not sure about the context of this particular one, but I think that might likely come to the issue of joining NATO, because there has been a pledge to Ukraine that they would have a bridge. This was mentioned at the Washington summit in 2024, that they would eventually join NATO, although no time frame was actually put on the table. There wasn't a year, there wasn't the ballpark year. So that could have been what it was.
Yeah. On that, and I'll have to jump in at this point. As you said, we're not 100% sure where all this is going, but of course it's a flurry of diplomacy and lots of events. We'll keep it covered. But look, thanks so much. Always a pleasure there to speak with you, Luis Wierenga. Much appreciated.
Our pleasure, Sasha. Great to be back. Have a good one.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay tuned right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.